Ireland, a nation forged in fire and resilience, from ancient Celtic kingdoms through centuries of strife to the birth of the modern republic. This is the story of Ireland.
Before Ireland had a name, before any kingdom claimed its green hills or any monastery lit its first candle, the island itself was being made by forces operating on timescales that make all of human history seem brief. The last great ice age gripped Ireland beneath glaciers as much as a kilometer thick, their enormous weight grinding down the landscape, carving river valleys, scouring lake basins, and depositing the deep, fertile soils that would eventually earn this island the name that travelers from distant lands would carry home in their memories, the Emerald Isle. When the ice finally retreated around 10,000 years ago, the landscape it uncovered was one of extraordinary natural richness. Dense forests of oak, ash, and hazel covering the lowlands, salmon-thick rivers cutting through valleys of dark peat bog, and a coastline of dramatic cliffs, sheltered bays, and offshore islands that provided both food and the natural harbors from which early boats could venture onto the surrounding Atlantic. The first human beings arrived perhaps 9,000 years ago, crossing from Britain along land connections and by simple craft, while those connections still existed before rising sea levels completed Ireland's island geography. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers moved through the forests and along the coastlines, leaving behind flint tools and shell middens, whose archaeological traces provide the first faint evidence of human life on this island. They could not have imagined what would be built here after them. The first great builders were arriving. Around 5,000 years ago, something remarkable was happening in the Boyne Valley of what is now County Meath that puts the famous monuments of ancient Egypt in a striking historical perspective. The Passage Tomb of Newgrange was constructed approximately 500 years before the Great Pyramid at Giza reached its final form. Yet its builders demonstrated engineering sophistication, astronomical knowledge, and organizational capability that challenge any simplistic assumptions about prehistoric Irish society. Newgrange is a circular mound roughly 80 meters across and 13 meters high, containing a long stone passage leading to a cruciform chamber where cremated human remains were deposited during religious ceremonies. What makes Newgrange truly extraordinary is its alignment. At the winter solstice, a precisely positioned roof box above the entrance allows a narrow shaft of sunlight to penetrate the entire length of the passage and illuminate the chamber floor for approximately 17 minutes. A phenomenon requiring such accurate astronomical observation and architectural precision that it commands genuine awe from anyone who witnesses it. Nearby at Noath and Douth, similarly impressive passage tombs amplified this monument-building tradition into a sacred landscape of considerable scale and evident religious significance. The people who built these structures lived in organized communities, cultivated crops, kept livestock, and evidently maintained ceremonial and religious traditions of extraordinary sophistication. Their names are unknown. Their language is unrecoverable. But Newgrange stands as their statement to every future generation. We were here, and we understood the movements of the sky. A new culture was spreading that would transform Ireland further. From around 600 BC onward, the gradual spread of Celtic culture from continental Europe brought new languages, new artistic traditions, new social structures, and new religious practices to Ireland in a process of cultural transformation that was less a sudden invasion than a prolonged, complex absorption of influences arriving through trade, migration, and cultural contact across centuries. The Celtic languages that eventually dominated Ireland produced the Gaelic tongue, whose descendants, Irish and Scottish Gaelic, survive as living languages today, remarkable monuments to linguistic continuity across more than 2,000 years of continuous use. Celtic material culture, expressed through the extraordinary metalwork of torques, brooches, and sword decorations worked in the La Tan style, demonstrated artistic sophistication, combining geometric abstraction with flowing natural forms in ways that remained influential in Irish decorative arts from the Iron Age through the medieval period and beyond. Irish society organized itself through a complex hierarchy of kings, nobles, professional classes, including poets and lawyers called brehons, craftspeople, and farmers, governed by the customary law system called Brehon law, whose sophisticated provisions covered everything from contract law to the rights of women in ways that sometimes exceeded contemporaneous legal systems elsewhere in Europe. The Druids served as religious specialists, scholars, and intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, their oral tradition preserving the mythological narratives that would eventually be recorded in medieval manuscripts and continue fascinating scholars and readers today. Legends were becoming history, and history was becoming legend. Ancient Ireland was never unified under a single political authority during the pre-Christian period, its political geography instead organized into a constantly shifting landscape of provincial kingdoms, Connacht, Leinster, Munster, and Ulster, each subdivided into smaller kingdoms called tuatha, each tuath governed by its own king, whose authority was legitimized through complex rituals connecting royal power to sacred landscape and divine approval. The concept of the High King of Ireland, an artery exercising some form of overall authority from the traditional seat of power at the Hill of Tara in County Meath, represented an aspiration toward unity that political reality consistently frustrated, with individual provincial kings contesting primacy through both warfare and complex alliance networks of marriage and fosterage that bound aristocratic families across the island's different regions. Tara itself, whose earthworks still define the Meath landscape, functioned as a ceremonial center of profound symbolic significance, its hilltop gathering place for the Feis Temro, the great assembly where the High King's legitimacy was formally celebrated, representing an ancient tradition of political and religious gathering that connected Irish kingship to the island's prehistoric sacred landscape. The Lia Fáil, the inauguration stone at Tara said to cry out beneath the feet of the rightful king, symbolized a conception of political authority.
The sea calls us. The winds are fierce. We press on. The village needs us.
Celtic-Irish culture regarded as
to the village.
fundamental to legitimate governance. A new faith was approaching that would transform every dimension of this ancient world. The story of Christianity's arrival in Ireland is inseparable from the figure of the man later canonized as St. Patrick, though the historical reality behind the legendary saint is both more complicated and in its own way more interesting than simple hagiography suggests. Patrick was a Romano-British Christian, probably born in the late 4th century, who was kidnapped as a teenager by Irish raiders and spent years in Ireland as a slave, tending sheep in conditions that he later described as having deepened his religious faith dramatically. After escaping and returning to Britain, he experienced what he interpreted as a divine call to return to Ireland as a missionary, and the mission he eventually undertook during the 5th century had consequences for Irish civilization that exceeded anything its participants could have anticipated. Christianity spread throughout Ireland with remarkable speed and relatively little of the violent conflict that religious transformation sometimes generated elsewhere. Perhaps because Irish society's existing professional classes, the poets, lawyers, and scholars, found in the new church's learning tradition a complementary rather than purely threatening institution that they could engage with on their own terms. The monastic tradition that took particularly deep root in Ireland, inspired by desert hermit traditions from the Eastern Mediterranean but adapted to Irish conditions and sensibilities, created institutions of extraordinary intellectual and spiritual vitality. Learning was becoming Ireland's greatest strength, and that strength was about to illuminate a continent. The monasteries that spread throughout Ireland from the 5th and 6th centuries onward became something the wider world had rarely seen before. Genuinely international centers of learning whose reputation attracted students, scholars, and pilgrims from throughout Britain and continental Europe, where the disruptions of the post-Roman period had severely damaged many previous centers of classical learning. At Clonmacnoise beside the Shannon, at Glendalough in the Wicklow Mountains, at Clonfert and Lismore, and dozens of other foundations, Irish monks combined Christian scholarship with a genuine enthusiasm for classical learning, preserving and copying Latin texts, developing the insular
My
script,
people,
whose
we gather
distinctive
on this
letter
sacred
forms
ground.
can be traced
Our
in
ancestors
manuscripts
watch.
from
We must stand
Ireland to
united.
northern Italy,
The winds of
and
change are
producing
upon
original
us.
works of theology,
United we stand!
poetry, and biblical commentary that were distributed throughout the European Church. The Book of Kells, created around 800 AD and now preserved at Trinity College, Dublin, represents perhaps the most celebrated single artifact of this monastic culture. Its intricate illuminations combining Christian symbolism with a complexity of geometric and zoomorphic ornament that required mathematical precision, extraordinary patience, and artistic mastery of the highest order. Irish missionaries, Columbanus to Burgundy and northern Italy, Columba to Iona and Scotland, Kilian to Franconia, spread Irish Christian culture throughout Europe with evangelical energy that made Ireland's spiritual influence felt across the continent for centuries. Monks were the scholars, the artists, the diplomats, and the teachers of their age. But ships were appearing on the horizon that would test everything these peaceful communities had built. In 795 AD, Viking longships appeared off the Irish coast for the first time, attacking the monastery of Rathlin Island with the same devastating suddenness they brought to Lindisfarne off England's northeastern coast just 2 years earlier. The raids that followed over the next several decades struck at the most vulnerable and wealthy targets in Ireland's landscape: the monasteries, whose accumulated treasure of sacred objects, manuscripts, and food stores made them irresistible targets for raiders whose shallow draft ships could penetrate the river systems and coastal inlets that gave access to previously protected interior locations. The psychological impact of these raids on Irish monastic culture was profound, with contemporary analysts recording each attack with a combination of detailed practical record and evident distress at the desecration of sacred sites. Archaeological evidence and documentary sources together paint a picture of sustained, economically motivated raiding that caused genuine damage to monastic institutions while simultaneously introducing into Ireland a highly dynamic, technologically sophisticated culture whose long-term influence on Irish society would prove far more complex than simple destruction. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were also traders, settlers, and builders who, once established in Ireland, contributed substantially to the economic and urban development that the island had previously lacked. Irish resistance organized around the existing provincial kingdoms, their warfare with the newcomers fluctuating between violent conflict and pragmatic accommodation as circumstances demanded. New cities were being born from this turbulent encounter between ancient Irish culture and Norse dynamism. The Vikings, who established permanent bases in Ireland during the 9th century, founded the nucleus of settlements that became Ireland's major cities, their practical genius for choosing harbors and trading locations leaving a permanent legacy in Irish urban geography. Dublin, from the Irish Dub Linn, meaning dark pool, grew from a Viking long fort, a fortified harbor base for raiding fleets, into a genuine trading town of increasing sophistication and commercial importance, its position on Dublin Bay providing excellent harbor access, while the Liffey River offered a navigable route into the Irish interior. Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork similarly developed from Norse foundations into permanent urban centers that functioned as connection points between Ireland's agricultural interior and the broader North Sea and Atlantic trading networks that Viking commercial networks had established. These Norse-Irish towns developed their own distinctive hybrid culture as Scandinavian settlers intermarried with Gaelic Irish communities, adopted Irish Christianity, learned Irish language, and over generations became what contemporaries called Hiberno-Norse, a people genuinely of both traditions rather than simply Norse settlers maintaining their distance from the Irish world around them. Dublin, in particular, grew in commercial significance throughout the 10th century, its trading connections extending to Britain, Scandinavia, and eventually to the broader Mediterranean and Islamic worlds through the networks that Viking commercial enterprise had created throughout much of the known world. Its wealth and strategic position made it a prize that multiple powers would compete to control. Another invasion was approaching that would reshape Ireland's political landscape once again. In 1169 and 1170, Norman knights arrived on the southeastern Irish coast at the invitation of Diarmait mac Murchada, the exiled king of Leinster, seeking military assistance in recovering his throne through an alliance that introduced into Ireland the same Norman military culture that had transformed England following 1066. The arrival of Strongbow, Richard de Clare,
Patience, my son. Each stroke must be perfect. Yes, master. The blue here? Just so. Now, the gold. It's beautiful.
19th century painting that now hangs in the National Gallery of Ireland symbolized the beginning of a new political chapter whose consequences would shape Irish history for centuries. King Henry II of England, alarmed by the possibility that his own Norman barons might establish an independent power base in Ireland, arrived in 1171 to assert his own overlordship over both the Anglo-Norman settlers and the Irish kings, establishing a political relationship between England and Ireland that would generate complex, frequently painful consequences for the following 8 centuries. The Anglo-Normans brought their characteristic castle-building culture to Ireland, with the stone keeps, modern Bailey fortifications, and later, more elaborate castle complexes that spread throughout areas of Norman settlement, providing physical evidence of their presence that remains visible throughout the Irish landscape today. Gaelic Irish culture did not simply capitulate before Norman influence, however. Outside the areas of densest Norman settlement, Irish political structures,
To the sea! Row, brothers!
cultural life continued with remarkable
Waves rise, hold
resilience,
steady!
adapting to the new political reality
For Odin and
while
glory!
preserving the essential characteristics of Gaelic civilization. Resistance was growing stronger with each generation. The 14th and 15th centuries witnessed a remarkable resurgence of Gaelic Irish culture that historians call the Gaelic Revival, as Anglo-Norman families who had settled in Ireland over preceding generations gradually absorbed into Irish culture through intermarriage, language adoption, and participation in Irish political and social life, while simultaneously the area of effective English crown control contracted toward the eastern coastal region known as the Pale. Gaelic lordships throughout Connacht, Ulster, and Munster maintained and in many areas expanded their authority, their courts patronizing the bardic poetry, music, genealogy, and historical learning that represented Irish high culture at its most sophisticated. The great bardic schools produced poets of extraordinary technical accomplishment, their compositions following strict metrical rules of remarkable complexity while celebrating the genealogy, generosity, and military accomplishments of the lords whose patronage sustained them. Irish traditional music, the harp in particular, as the instrument of aristocratic culture, alongside the distinctive vocal and instrumental traditions that would eventually evolve into the rich sean-nós singing and ensemble playing traditions of later centuries, flourished within these Gaelic courts as expressions of cultural identity and aristocratic prestige simultaneously. The laws against Irish cultural practices, known as the Statutes of Kilkenny, passed in 1366 to prevent further Gaelic cultural absorption of Anglo-Norman settlers, reflected from the English crown's perspective the remarkable success of Irish cultural resilience in reclaiming cultural territory, even as political territory remained contested. Ireland could reclaim its identity, even when it could not always reclaim its political sovereignty. The 16th and 17th centuries brought Ireland into a prolonged and often devastating period of conflict that combined religious change, colonial plantation, military conquest, and cultural suppression in ways that left permanent marks on the Irish landscape, population, and collective memory. The Protestant Reformation, embraced by the English crown under Henry VIII and pursued with
Fresh
varying
catch from the
intensity
river!
by
Get it while
subsequent
it's
Tudor
fresh!
monarchs,
I'll take
created a
2
religious
barrels of ale.
divide in Ireland
Right away,
that
sir. That'll be
overlapped
10
with
silver.
and intensified
Keep the path
existing
clear for the Lord's
political and
arrival.
ethnic tensions, as Gaelic, Irish, and Old English Catholic populations found themselves increasingly at odds with a Protestant New English settler class backed by crown authority. The plantation system, through which confiscated Irish lands were redistributed to Protestant settlers from England and Scotland, most significantly in Ulster during the early 17th century, restructured land ownership throughout much of the island in ways that created social divisions whose consequences persisted into the 20th century. and whose legacies continue shaping aspects of contemporary Irish and Northern Irish society. The 9 Years' War of 1593 to 1603, in which the Ulster chieftains Hugh O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell led the most formidable Gaelic Irish military resistance to English expansion, ended with the flight of the Earls in 1607, as the defeated Ulster lords departed Ireland permanently, marking in many respects the end of the Gaelic political order that had organized Irish society for millennia. Yet Irish culture proved far more durable than the political structures that had contained it. Poets, musicians, and storytellers preserved in living
Fresh catch from the river! Get it while it's fresh! I'll take 2 barrels of ale. Right away, sir. That'll be 10 silver. Keep the path clear for the Lord's arrival. My lords, the enemy gathers strength. We cannot ignore this.
Our warriors are ready.
Then to victory.
Represents one of the most remarkable cultural achievements in European history. The Irish language, systematically discouraged and occasionally actively suppressed during periods of English colonial governance, never died despite losing official status, retreating from the towns and the more economically integrated eastern regions, while maintaining its deepest roots in the western coastal communities of Connacht, Munster, and Ulster that would later be designated the Gaeltacht. The bardic tradition, whose professional practitioners had maintained elaborate courts of high literary culture throughout the medieval period, was effectively destroyed as a professional institution during the 17th century, but the oral tradition of storytelling, folk poetry, and communal music-making that existed alongside it in communities throughout the island proved far more resilient, carrying the accumulated cultural memory of centuries in forms that required no professional patronage or institutional support to survive. The Willian pipes, the fiddle, the bodhrán, and the distinctive musical idiom that evolved through centuries of community practice preserved an Irish musical identity that eventually became one of the most internationally recognized and loved folk music traditions in the world. The hedge schools, where education was maintained in defiance of laws restricting Catholic Irish access to schooling, preserved literacy and Latin learning in circumstances of practical difficulty that enhanced rather than diminished their cultural significance. The modern age was approaching, and Ireland would meet it on its own terms. The 18th and 19th centuries brought Ireland into the economic transformations of the industrial age in ways that differed significantly from the patterns experienced in Britain, reflecting both the structural conditions of colonial economy and the distinctive geography and resources of the Irish island. Belfast and its surrounding region in Ulster developed genuine industrial capacity, particularly in linen and later in cotton textile manufacturing, and eventually in the shipbuilding industry that would make Belfast's Harland and Wolff shipyard one of the world's most famous, launching vessels including the ill-fated RMS Titanic in 1911. The rest of Ireland industrialized more slowly and partially, its economy remaining primarily agricultural in character throughout the 19th century in ways that made the catastrophic failure of the potato harvest between 1845 and 1852, the Great Famine, a disaster of proportions that transformed the island's demographic reality permanently. The famine killed approximately 1 million people through starvation and related disease, while driving another million or more to emigrate, initiating a pattern of population decline through emigration that continued for well over a century and reduced Ireland's population from approximately 8 million before the famine to barely 4 million by the early 20th century. The famine's causes, course, and consequences became and remain central to Irish historical consciousness, shaping attitudes toward land ownership, emigration, national identity, and the relationship with Britain in ways that influenced every subsequent chapter of Irish history. A movement for change was growing steadily stronger from these seeds of catastrophe. The 19th and early 20th centuries in Ireland generated an extraordinary concentration of political movements, cultural revivals, and constitutional campaigns whose combined energy drove the island toward fundamental transformation of its political status within an impressively compressed historical timeframe. Daniel O'Connell's mass movements for Catholic emancipation achieved in 1829, and for repeal of the Act of Union demonstrated that organized popular politics could achieve constitutional change through peaceful mobilization of enormous public support. Charles Stewart Parnell's parliamentary campaign for Home Rule brought Irish self-governance to the threshold of achievement before his political career was destroyed by personal scandal, leaving a legacy of frustrated expectation that radicalized subsequent generations. The Gaelic revival of the late 19th century, expressed through organizations including the Gaelic Athletic Association, founded in 1884, and the Gaelic League, founded in 1893, deliberately strengthened Irish cultural identity as a foundation for political aspiration, reviving the Irish language, promoting traditional sports, and creating institutional expression for the belief that Irish cultural distinctiveness demanded political recognition. The Abbey Theatre, founded in 1904 by W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory, gave Ireland a national cultural institution that produced drama of international significance while simultaneously serving as a platform for the imaginative expression of Irish national consciousness. The Easter Rising of 1916, though militarily unsuccessful and initially unpopular, transformed through the subsequent execution of its leaders into the foundational event of modern Irish nationalism. History was reaching its turning point. The War of Independence that followed the 1916 Rising between 1919 and 1921, and the subsequent Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations that produced the Irish Free State in December 1921, created a new Irish political reality, while also generating the Civil War of 1922 to 1923, in which former comrades fought each other over the treaty's terms in a conflict that divided families and communities, with a bitterness whose political legacy persisted in Irish politics for generations. The Irish Free State that emerged from these turbulent years was a democracy in a Europe where democracy was increasingly under threat. Choosing political stability and constitutional development through the peaceful transfer of power in 1932 when Eamon de Valera's Fianna Fáil party came to government, an event whose significance as a demonstration of democratic maturity deserves recognition alongside its purely partisan political dimensions. The 1937 Constitution established the legal and institutional framework of the Irish state in terms that reflected both the distinctive values of Irish Catholic nationalism dominant in that period and the democratic principles that would provide a foundation for subsequent evolution. The Declaration of the Republic in 1949 completed the formal separation from the British Commonwealth that earlier political steps had progressively advanced. Economic development, initially painfully slow as the new state worked within limited resources and considerable social conservatism, gradually accelerated through the late 1950s and 1960s as economic planning, foreign investment, and European community membership, beginning in 1973, opened new paths toward the prosperity that later generations would experience. The island was continuing to evolve toward its modern identity. Contemporary Ireland presents a striking example of rapid economic and social transformation occurring within a society simultaneously committed to preserving ancient traditions whose depth and vitality give Irish culture its distinctive character. The Celtic Tiger economic boom of the 1990s and early 2000s transformed Ireland from one of Western Europe's poorer economies into one of its most dynamic, with foreign direct investment, particularly from American technology and pharmaceutical companies attracted by Ireland's educated workforce, low corporate tax rates, and English-language environment, driving a period of growth and prosperity whose prosperity changed Irish society's physical landscape, demographic composition, and self-image within a single generation. The 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath tested Irish resilience severely, imposing a painful period of economic contraction and austerity, whose consequences for ordinary Irish families were genuinely difficult, before recovery through the following decade restored economic momentum and brought new challenges of housing affordability, infrastructure pressure, and management of a rapidly growing and increasingly diverse population. Social change accumulated through referendums and cultural evolution that transformed Irish society's relationship with the Catholic Church, whose institutional authority and moral influence had been dominant throughout much of the state's history, but which faced devastating credibility damage from revelations of clerical child abuse and institutional failures. Ireland legalized divorce in 1995, equal marriage in 2015, and repealed the constitutional abortion ban in 2018, each change reflecting a society actively reconsidering the relationship between religious tradition and civic pluralism. Its influence was extending far beyond its shores in ways that the diaspora had been building for generations. The Irish diaspora, those millions of people throughout the world who trace their ancestry to Ireland and maintain various degrees of connection to Irish culture, language, and identity, represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural persistence across geographic displacement. The emigration waves driven by the famine, by economic necessity throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by the limited opportunities of the mid-20th century Irish economy, and more recently by younger people pursuing opportunities in a globalized world, collectively created Irish communities throughout North America, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and many other countries whose combined population far exceeds that of the island itself. Approximately 70 to 80 million people worldwide claim Irish heritage, a number that makes the Irish diaspora proportionally one of the largest of any nation relative to its homeland population. These diaspora communities maintained Irish identity through churches, cultural organizations, political networks, music traditions, sporting associations, and the simple human transmission of stories, recipes, songs, and memories from parents and grandparents to children and grandchildren. Irish America's political influence played a significant role in supporting the peace process in Northern Ireland during the 1990s, demonstrating how diaspora communities could contribute practically to their ancestral homeland's political development, rather than merely celebrating a romanticized heritage from a safe distance. The Irish pub spread throughout the world's cities as a social institution, combining hospitality, music, conversation, and community, carries something genuinely Irish wherever it appears, a cultural export of remarkable durability. Ireland's greatest legacy remained to be fully understood. Ireland's mythological tradition, the Tuatha De Danann, the Fianna of Fionn Mac Cumhail, the great Ulster cycle tales of Cú Chulainn and the Red Branch Knights, the love stories of Deirdre and Gráinne, represents one of Europe's most extensive and imaginatively rich bodies of mythology, preserved through the same monastic tradition that also preserved Christian scholarship and classical learning. The monks who wrote down these ancient oral narratives in medieval manuscripts were doing something remarkable. They were preserving the pre-Christian mythological inheritance of their culture, even as they practiced a religion that might have been expected to discourage such preservation. Recognizing apparently that these stories carried something essential about Irish identity that deserved to be maintained alongside the new faith's own narratives. The result was the survival of mythological material of extraordinary depth and imaginative variety, whose influence on subsequent Irish literature, from the medieval period through the literary revival to contemporary fiction and poetry, has been profound and continuous. W.B. Yeats drew deeply on Irish mythology in his poetry. James Joyce wove Homeric parallels through A Dublin Day. Seamus Heaney explored the bog bodies that connected contemporary Ireland to its ancient past. Samuel Beckett distilled Irish philosophical pessimism into theatrical forms of global significance. These and many other writers demonstrated that Irish literature's engagement with its own deepest traditions produced work capable of speaking to universal human experience rather than merely local interest. The stories endured because they were true in ways that historical fact alone cannot achieve. Strip away the famous landmarks, the celebrated literary names, the political milestones, and the economic statistics, and what defines Ireland most essentially is the accumulated lives of ordinary people whose daily work, community bonds, family relationships, and cultural practices constitute the actual living substance of Irish civilization, across its thousands of years of continuous development. The fishing families of the Aran Islands,
From ancient mounds to Celtic kingdoms, Viking settlements and Norman castles, to the Ireland of today, Ogham stands witness across 5,000
rather
years.
than a cultural performance for outside audiences. The small farmers of the West, whose relationship with the land carried both the memory of famine dispossession and a continuing determination to maintain independence on their own ground, despite economic disadvantages that would have driven most modern economic analysis toward different conclusions. The women whose labor in home, field, and community sustained Irish rural and urban life across centuries, during which official history concentrated its attention almost entirely elsewhere. The musicians in kitchen sessions and festival stages who kept the tradition alive through generations when its cultural value was not always officially recognized or economically rewarded. The teachers, priests, nuns, doctors, nurses, shopkeepers, publicans, builders, and civil servants who built the institutions and maintained the daily services through which Irish society functioned in its prosaic, essential, unheroic reality. The immigrants who arrived in recent decades from Poland, Nigeria, Brazil, the Philippines, and dozens of other countries, adding new threads to an Irish identity that has been woven from multiple influences since its very beginning. The full story is coming together. Empires rose and fell across the centuries of Ireland's long existence as a distinct civilization. Roman legions that conquered much of Britain halted at its western sea and left Ireland to its own development, an accident of geography that allowed Irish culture to maintain a continuity unbroken by Roman occupation. Viking raiders who terrified European coastlines eventually settled, intermarried, and contributed the cities and trading networks that became essential components of Irish economic life. Norman lords who arrived with conquest in their plans found themselves absorbed by a culture more resilient than their military superiority prepared them to expect. Colonial plantations reshaped the island's demographic and economic geography, while the culture they sought to suppress found other forms in which to preserve itself. Monks, bent over manuscripts by candlelight, preserved knowledge that the wider world needed, sending it back out through missionaries and scholars who carried Irish learning to a continent emerging from chaos. Poets preserved memory when political structures failed. Musicians maintained identity when language was under pressure. Storytellers kept the mythological inheritance alive through centuries when its professional practitioners had no institutional support. Through every invasion and every catastrophe, every famine and every diaspora, every political defeat and every cultural suppression, Ireland remained unmistakably itself, an island whose deep roots in landscape, language, music, faith, and story proved stronger than any external force that attempted to uproot them. Its history has inspired the world not because it was easy, but because it endured, and its story is still being written, with the same resilience and imagination that carried it through every previous century.